Hi everyone, I'm Glenn Deason, and today I have the great pleasure to speak with Brian Berletic, a former US Marine who has since worked as an analyst and a journalist. So Brian, it's great to finally meet you. I've been following you for some time, so it's a great privilege.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me on.
So I've read your work and followed your programs for quite some time, and you've been very spot on in your analysis as well as your predictions. But I guess unfortunately for you, we live in societies now that tend to reward the adherence to government-approved narratives. So we therefore see people who get it wrong in every single war nonetheless floats to the top around the international media. And that's some of the thing I want to discuss with you today. That is I guess the mechanisms for manipulating civil society, media, constructing narratives, manufacturing consent. Because if we're going to discuss this, it's we can't really do it without discussing the NGOs as well as USAID. Now, USAID and especially the Endowment for Democracy is something that you focused on for quite some time before Trump began to defund them. I wanted to discuss some of these issues, I guess, with what does it mean of Trump defunding it? Is he ending the deep state, or is he reinventing the deep state as his own personal instrument? But I thought we can first uh, just delve into this issue of these NGOs as well as USAID, because many people are, they see this as an attack on non-governmental organizations who are supporting democracy, human rights, and civil society around the world. What would be your response?
If you stop and think what democracy actually should mean, not what people believe it means, it is a process of self-determination. So if a foreign country is giving money and boosting groups in a particular country to promote democracy, it is actually foreign interference. It is actually undermining the ability of that country to determine their own matters themselves. It is blatant foreign interference, which is why the US and Europe all have laws banning other countries from doing this to them. And so it's just a rhetorical smokescreen they use to get away with political interference. And it is a blatant lie, but it is a very convincing lie for so many people because it appeals to their idealism. And a lot of people want to see something that is nice, something that is good, and they don't want to see what ulterior motives there may be behind it. So this is why it has persisted for so long, and this is why actually it's continuing. People might think that it has been defunded, but it hasn't. It's continuing. You have to follow up on the programs that were actually being funded and see, did they stop or are they still going? And if they're still going, why?
Yeah, something a bit strange about this whole thing that we argue that free media, it means now that it's financed by USAID, as we found out with the defunding by Trump was that 85 to 90% of the Ukrainian media have been receiving finance from the United States, and this is then called independent media, as if there would be no national interests involved. And I guess we saw this in Georgia as well. When they had their elections, I found it so absurd to watch the news because the main argument was, the Georgian government, which was elected, is not legitimate because, our NGOs decided to call them Putinists. And meanwhile, the people marching here, which the NGOs are assisting in terms of organizing, they are the real democracy. They're the people. So now suddenly all they needed was a few pictures on a screen and of people marching with the NGOs and a few slogans about democracy, and suddenly we're willing to topple a democratically elected government, which the prime minister there is warning that this would be, could destroy the country. It's very strange how we redefined it, but but one can argue that simply too much power concentrated within these institutions, and you can say, well, Western hegemony or American leadership, Georgia leaning towards the West is democracy as opposed to leaning to an authoritarian Russia. But But these institutions, they were very deliberately set up for this purpose, especially the National Endowment for Democracy, though, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And if you read newspaper articles from, say, the New York Times, um, during the 1980s, when the National Endowment for Democracy was first rolled out, they admitted that it's just picking up where the CIA left off in terms of covert regime change. They wanted to bring it out in the open and kind of market covert regime change as promoting democracy. But again, there's this inherent paradox in doing so. You are talking about promoting self-determination by interfering in the process as a foreign nation in violation of international law. The UN Charter has very clear prohibitions against undermining the political independence of a nation. And you have to think about these opposition groups. They would literally not exist without this U.S. government funding. And a lot of people are pointing to just to address this situation with Ukraine, these groups losing their funding. It didn't work. They lost the war, so they're just pulling the plug on it. I'm in a country where the U.S. is still very much so promoting political interference here, and all of the so-called independent media that are completely dependent on Washington and Western private foundations. They are still very much in business, and they still continue to pursue regime change, U.S.-backed regime change here in Southeast Asia. So people have to be very careful about why is the U.S. doing this? Why are we only hearing about the plug being pulled in Ukraine? I mean, it's very obvious it's connected to what we're seeing in the headlines now about the talks between the U.S. and Russia. This is kind of a carrot or a gift being given to make this whole process the U.S. is going through seem more convincing. But again, very much so around the world, so-called independent media continues to depend on Washington. And again, people have to ask themselves, who follow the money? Who is funding this? And what could their possible motive be? And if you do that, it becomes very clear that this has nothing to do with democracy. This is about the U.S. projecting power abroad and politically capturing sovereign nations, undermining their sovereignty. So again, it is the exact opposite of democracy.
Yeah, and given that this money is channeled through this so-called non-governmental organizations, even though they're financed and often staffed with people from government, it somehow also makes it legitimate, but only for one side. And I find this very interesting that in Georgia, the United States pushed in about $40 million to interfere in its elections, but they just stamped it as democracy, and then it's somehow okay. And then you can compare this to Romania, where they alleged that there was a TikTok campaign by Russia which helped to get one side elected. It proved to be incorrect and false news or fake news, but nonetheless, they annulled the entire presidential election because of this unsubstantiated accusation. So one side, you don't need any evidence at all to cancel an entire election if the candidate wants an end to the war. And on the other side, when Georgia, where the prime minister warned that the United States might actually push for a regime change so they can make a second front against Russia. Here you can pump in any money in the world and it's all legitimate. So there doesn't seem to be any clear rules besides, funneling some money through it and calling it civil society. It's but I thought it was interesting what you said about Asia, because if now the United States is more or less saying that the unipolarity or global primacy is over, which means it has to start to prioritize. Now, if you want to pivot to Asia, and that entails pivot a bit away from the Middle East and Europe, which Trump is signaling. Well, the NGOs, they mainly worked in the Middle East with the Arab Spring, and then we had the color revolutions across Europe, where democratically elected governments were toppled. But now, of course, if US is pivoting away, I guess it would make sense and not contradictory to see the financing or Trump defunding a lot of these groups, which perpetuates conflicts and ties the Americans down. But if they are pivoting to Asia, that I guess is a good reason why we should be putting an eye on whether or not those activities are defunded. But are they? What are you seeing from your end? Not only are you located in Southeast Asia, but you've been following the NGO activity there quite closely as well.
As a matter of fact, I started geopolitical analysis because of my desire to raise awareness of what was happening here. I was in the U.S. Marines. I left the Marines in protest to the invasion of Iraq, the upcoming invasion of Iraq, and I literally moved to the other side of the planet, trying to get away from U.S. The U.S. I didn't want anything to do with their foreign policy. I didn't want to help contribute to it in any shape, form, or way. But what I noticed here is that the U.S. is extremely involved in interfering in the local government and in all kinds of ways, basically trying to capture the entire country, capturing the media, capturing and controlling the media, infiltrating the education system, approaching young people who are going into the legal fields, the media, politics, even business, and giving them these free exchange programs and scholarships to go to the US and basically indoctrinate them so that when they go back to their country, they're now plugged into this personal and professional network in the West. And they're very proud of that. They feel it's a great personal achievement. They're really exploiting human ego here. And they will pursue Western interests, even at the expense of their own country's interests, to stay plugged into those personal and professional networks. And I want people to look up it's on YouTube, it's on video sharing networks, the 4 to 5 hour, I mean, I know it's a long hearing, but there was a US Senate hearing for this USAID so-called defunding, and all throughout the hearing, and it was chaired by a Republican who supported the Trump administration's supposed defunding of the organization. And all throughout the hearing, they reiterated that they had not defunded all of these programs. They only defunded the programs dealing with DEI, transgender issues, other types of issues like that, these political wedge issues that the left and the right use to divide and distract people at home, and also try to create the same dynamic in a targeted country. They're only defunding that. Everything else is still being funded. All of the invasive, manipulative, interfering programs the U.S. has been funding all along continue unabated all around the world. I can't even remember how many times the chair of the hearing said, we need USAID to be countering China and its Belt and Road Initiative, not talking about DEI or funding transgender operas around the world. So if people actually listen to what they're really saying, this isn't about defunding and stopping US interference abroad. It's making it more efficient, cutting out this political bloat that has been attached to it throughout the Biden administration, streamlining it, sharpening it, if you will, so that it could do a more efficient job of cutting down a targeted nation's sovereignty. So it's very important to go at least skip through it and listen to it and try to extract what they're really talking about versus the headlines and the sound bites people are citing. And I get it. People are aware of it. They're increasingly aware of it. And it upsets them and they want to see it end. And when they hear that it's being ended, they want to believe that. But you have to follow up. You have to actually make sure that it ended. I'm on the receiving end of it. So I have added incentive to check and see, are these organizations still open? Are they still active? Here in Thailand, where I'm based, they're all active. None of them have shut down. There were 1 or 2 programs that were temporarily, the funding was temporarily frozen, but the stream of money is still coming in. I will point something else out to people. I've been warning for years that because of growing awareness over USAID, NED, and even private foundations that work adjacent to them, like George Soros's Open Society, there's growing awareness of this across the general public around the world, and also inside governments who are pushing back with foreign agent laws, just like in Georgia, as a matter of fact. And so there has been growing awareness of this. The US sees this, and they have reacted by diversifying and rerouting funding from USAID, from NED, through different avenues. So the funding isn't stopping in many cases. It's being rerouted. It's being redistributed so it's harder to track, harder to expose, harder to raise awareness and opposition to it. So this has been happening for years. And I would say the last 1 or 2 years has become really hard. You know this organization is funded by the US government, but it is so hard to find the funding. And that was very deliberate because that they're reacting to this. So this isn't change for the better. This is a method, a tool being recamouflaged, reorganized, and continuing.
Well, I guess this is one of the challenges with Trump's very bombastic language is it grabs all the attention, which means people are either excited or they're horrified, and people tend to read into whatever he says. They see what they want to see effectively. So on one side they see, oh no, he's attacking our, NGO instruments of power to influence well the world, and the other side is no, he's finally dismantling the empire, removing these very illegitimate tools. So yeah, we're all either horrified or celebrating, but it does beg the question, though, why is it being done? And I think this is a key issue, at least to ask it, because one can present many different hypotheses. That is, he could be just worried about all the money, which means because the US is being bled dry. It could be ideology, as you mentioned, is a lot of these things like financing sex changes and LGBT programs in Guatemala. This very strange way to spend money during decline of an empire. This is not that ideal, and we often see this as well. That ideology can result in infightings within a state. This was obviously Russia Gate, but it was also in Britain they had the Integrity Initiative, which was meant to manipulate, create consent through these clusters of academics, journalists. And anyways, they ended up turning on their own opposition. So you have the cost, you have possibly the ideology. This could be a reason for Trump to defund it. So a cynic in me would suspect that even though this is very much a legitimate source of power, but nonetheless, given his experiences in his first administration, he sees it as a constraint on power, something simply to remove. Others might see it as being winding down the empire, but I guess the reasoning is quite important. And if what you're saying is correct, that this is mainly about shifting focus to Asia and getting rid of all these ideological projects, then some people might be celebrating a bit too early. And I have to admit, I think I also got caught up a little bit in his language, because my first thought was, oh, finally we're going to get rid of these NGOs, which is causing so much problems and wars and conflicts and undermining of civil society. But why, I guess, is important. I don't see him necessarily walking away from empire, but these institutions, do you see any of them being preserved in Europe? Because you mentioned some of them are simply being rebranded. The old ones have been banned, so they're just funneling money through new fronts. Did you see this happening in Europe as well, or is it more of a pull out completely?
No, I don't think there's any. A lot of people are talking about a U.S.-European split. I mean, the European Union is an extension of American power, and why would they voluntarily ever give that up? They're not. And so looking at the programs in Europe, especially the programs the US uses to maintain the political capture of Europe, those are all going to stay in place. Another thing that I noticed is not just rerouting money through, supposedly private funds. People have to look at the history of US interference abroad and how the CIA, before there was a National Endowment for Democracy, used so-called private foundations as fronts to do all of this. The Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation are really prominent examples of this. Foundations that still exist and are still used by the US for this very purpose. So there was that. And there's a lot of that now being done all over again. Another aspect was the US, especially here, I watched this whole process unfold. People in Thailand were increasingly aware of the US interfering in their internal political affairs. It was causing blowback. There was anger at the US government for doing this. And this was bipartisan. This happened all throughout the Obama administration, the last Trump administration, and the Biden administration. People were catching on. So what the US began doing was outsourcing it to Europe. There were European embassies visiting the protests, supporting the protesters, meeting with the protesters, because the Thai people really weren't associating Europe yet with this type of interference. It was American, and it was offensive when America did it. It seemed more benign when Europe was doing it. So this is an ongoing game the U.S. plays. It is a constant process of reinventing it in a way that is believable and sustainable. So it's very important to keep an eye on that. Now, again, during the 4 to 5 hour Senate hearing, they even talked about how in the past, all the way back to Reagan and all these other administrations long since passed, how when there was a transition from one president to the other, they would look at US aid and they would say, what are all these programs doing? Get them out. And it was all about political wedge issues. So they took turns doing this. And there's a heavy element of that. This is just the process of keeping up the appearance of left, right, keeping people locked into this paradigm so they don't see through the entire thing and see what the US as a whole system is doing. They're only focused on one side, scared and angry at one side and driven into the arms of the other side. This is the dynamic they want to maintain. So there's a heavy element of that. They're really, in terms of ideology, do we honestly believe that this is a driving factor in any US presidential administration, or is this a tool to further manipulate, control, and mislead people?
Yeah, no, it's also very interesting. You said that this happened even before the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, because yeah, I did research for a book I wrote on political propaganda, and it's quite interesting that there's a wide consensus in the literature that the US and UK had far more efficient propaganda throughout the Cold War than the Soviet Union. Not reflecting on being good or bad. It's just because the tools you have. Because in propaganda, the source credibility is important, as all communication theory suggests. The extent to which a message is accepted by the receiver depends very much on who's sending it. So if it's sent by someone who's seen to be objective or have altruistic ambitions, then yeah, it's more likely to be accepted. And yeah, the Soviet Union, everything was state-centric, while the British and Americans, they could use private organizations, charity, independent institutions, NGO. They could go through a lot of different avenues in order to obtain that source credibility. And this is also what made it very effective. And as Reagan also recognized when he established the National Endowment for Democracy back in '83 was this whole idea of hiding in plain sight. I mean, was great, a human rights organization. Now, it's not only you can't get caught, but even if someone criticizes it, it's legitimate. You know, democracy, freedom, something unites all people. Indeed, if we don't do this, then we are succumbing to the demands of authoritarian states. So suddenly, instead of hiding, it's almost an obligation, a responsibility to do this. And yeah, it doesn't seem to bother anyone that what they're actually doing, which is why it's interesting. People like you look at the details, because if we shift over to Ukraine, not only did these NGOs have a key role in toppling the government there in 2004 and also 2014, but and then financing a lot of the media organizations, the majority of them across Ukraine, to maintain its control and power. But even back in 2019, when Zelensky won, this massive peace mandate with 73% of the vote, the same NGOs which were financed in Ukraine openly threatened Zelensky. They put red lines. If you try to implement any of this, you will have political instability. Essentially, putting red lines. You can't negotiate with Russia without the West. You can't. The whole peace platform he put forward. You can't talk to Donbass. You can't make peace with the Russians. All of this will undermine our security. So this is what the non-governmental organizations do. They hijack the elections. They hijack the media. They hijack the election results. It's quite extraordinary. But everything is whitewashed. I even had a NGO here in Norway, financed, of course, by the National Endowment for Democracy and the U.S. State Department, who who said that, well, Professor Deason is criticizing the NGOs, which means he's attacking civil society. And I said the opposite. You're undermining, you are not civil society, you're hijacking it, but it doesn't matter. They've now taken on that role. So but I wanted to just bring it a little bit over to the Ukraine war, because I think a lot of this, the same thing that might apply there. Trump makes huge statements. Everyone sees more or less what they want to see. Some people see, oh, you betrayed the Ukrainians because we have to fight till the bitter end. Others are celebrating because he's bringing an end to the war. But there's also some confusing messages here. How do you see this?
U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth laid out the entire plan, right out again, hidden in plain sight. He's talking about going from 2% to 5% of GDP in terms of European GDP expenditure on NATO. So we're talking about enlarging NATO. He's also talking about Western forces placed in Ukraine as peacekeepers to essentially freeze the conflict. This is exactly what the U.S. did in Syria. I mean, we all just watched that whole process unfold, and we saw the final result. They wanted to appear as if they were pursuing peace, but they were really just buying time. Worse than that, this is a cycle that has repeated itself specifically in regards to Russia. People aren't looking at that. Again, just as you say, Glenn, they're seeing and hearing what they want to see and hear, and they're ignoring everything else, including a very clear pattern that has emerged. I have a timeline here where we remember the Bush Jr. administration, all throughout it, antagonism, aggression, proxy war against Russia. They literally did the exact same thing, but instead of Ukraine, they used Georgia from 2003 when they overthrew the government to 2008 as they militarized Georgia and then encouraged them to attack Russian forces. They walked away from arms control treaties. They put pressure on Russia. They demonized Russia. And then in 2009, under the Obama administration, because they hit a brick wall, Russia crushed the Georgian military, and they hit a brick wall. So they needed to buy time to get their next proxy ready and get ready for the next push. So under the Obama administration in 2009, they did this big reset featuring then U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, of all people. I remember it. She's posing with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. They had a physical prop, a reset button, and and Hillary Clinton was smiling ear to ear, all while they were doing this. The Obama administration was planning to finally and completely overthrow the government of Ukraine. And in 2014, they did. And then from 2014 to 2022, they did the same thing they did with Georgia, arming it, training the Ukrainian forces, building out NATO infrastructure. It wasn't officially NATO infrastructure, but it was obviously Western military infrastructure for use by NATO in the future. And remember, it was the Trump administration that began publicly arming Ukraine and enthusiastically. And even to this day, he still brags about that. It was also under the Trump administration that the U.S. walked away from another arms control treaty, just like the Bush administration. He even began sanctioning Europe over the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This is what he said, Germany is going to become a hostage of Russia. This is language that we normally associate with the Biden administration. This was also, again, people selectively hearing, being said during the first Trump administration. And of course, we know the end result here. Russia reacted with the special military operation, because what is NATO? Why does it exist? It exists for the sole purpose of encroaching upon, encircling, containing Russia, and eventually absorbing Russia itself. That's why it exists. And this is why Russia is reacting to it in a sense of self-preservation. From 2022 to 2025, we watched this conflict unfold. The U.S. exhausted its arms and ammunition, and it has hit another brick wall. So what do you think comes next? A reset. And it just so happens that President Trump is the man in office, probably the perfect candidate for convincingly selling this reset. Again, getting this whole cycle to go around all over again. But again, if we listen to Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, he's laying out a program of freezing the conflict, buying time to expand NATO, its budget, expand the U.S., and Europe's military industrial base. For what? What do they need to expand it for? Do you remember during his recent talk in Brussels, he said the one lesson we learned from this conflict is that if you ignore your military industrial base, you're going to lose the war. So we need to expand our military industrial base. Do you think they actually learned anything about this whole conflict in Ukraine other than they need more weapons and arms so the next time they try this, they succeed? I mean, that's what they're saying. And if you listen, if you cut through the left-right paradigm, just listen to what they're saying. That is literally what they're saying. That's what they're laying out. And of course, it's not to ramble on too much, but Russia has to be polite. They have to be patient, and they have to go along with this. They have to at least publicly grant benefit of the doubt to the United States, because if they didn't, it would look very badly. It would play right into the Americans' hands. So, oh, we're trying to reach out and establish peace, and you will not. And there's a heavy element of that with the whole Trump plan to have the U.S., Russia, and China have their military budgets. But that is some trickery. Also, maybe we could get into that later or at another time.
Yeah, no, well, that's what I meant, these confusing messages. Because first, the Washington saying that we'll put more sanctions on the Russians, we'll drive down the oil prices to crush the Russian economy, and then Marco Rubio's arguing, yeah, well, we might end sanctions. I'm not sure. Again, always, is this just displaying a carrot and a stick, or talking to different audiences, or just being disingenuous? But as you said, they also want to increase NATO financing to 5%, but they're also, and they said they want to make NATO great again, whatever that might mean. But at the same time, Trump's saying, we should disarm, cut our budgets, defense budgets with the Russians and the Chinese. They're also calling for more arms control. And at the same time, of course, it was Trump who ripped up all of these agreements for arms control in his first administration. So, yeah, that's why it's reasonable to at least reasonable to ask the question, well, why is this being done? Is there some desire to wind down the empire, or is this just, oops, we lost the war, we have to, as I said, do a reset, which we, remobilize and prepare for the next conflict. But but this is also why the Russians are insisting that in Ukraine, whatever deal comes, it has to be permanent end. There has to be a political solution, because otherwise, this has been going on since 2014 now, and they see that every deal they made with the West, from the deal they did back in 2014 with the unity government in Kiev, the Minsk agreement, the Istanbul agreement. Every time there's an effort to make a deal, or a deal has already been made, it's always either undermined or sabotaged. So they want this, which is why I'm wondering that now the Americans are saying, well, Rubio said we need a permanent end to this war, not just a temporary ceasefire, which is what the Russians want to hear. But at the same time, he's talking about these peacekeepers, possible security guarantees from the Europeans, even though the United States might not join in. It's also Rubio said we might, unipolarity is over, which suggests now we have to be one among many other great powers, which sounds great. Now you can begin to harmonize interests. America doesn't have to pursue security through dominance, its ability to take into account each other's consideration. At the same time, they seem to be upping the ante against the Chinese. So why do you need to knock out the Chinese if you're happy with being one among many? And of course, Trump taking credit for Nord Stream, I think that was a good point as well. This is it's a very strange thing to make, but also to be critical though, it's are they being belligerent, or are they faking belligerence? Because often you need a hawkish language in order to get away with peace. So, for example, I think Reagan was the only one who could get away with sitting down with the Soviets and trying to end the Cold War, given that he was such a hawk. No one would accuse him of being soft. They said the same thing applied to Russia. That is, Yeltsin would never have been able to make a deal with the Chinese to make territorial concessions. But Putin, no one would accuse him of being weak on Russian sovereignty. So he was in a stronger position to do so. And of course, Trump learned some lessons in 2016 that he was Yeah, he wanted to get along with Russia, and he was punished and labeled an agent of Russia. So, are they faking to some extent their belligerence, or are they faking their kindness or their willingness to change path completely? How would you find an indicator, I guess, for what they're actually doing? Because again, with Trump, much like in the Middle East, they make all this noise and a big splash, and in this chaos, they seem to be, charting a path, navigating something. They wouldn't have been able to, challenge the status quo without making such a mess. But do you have any, I guess it's too much to ask, but any damning evidence that they're definitely going this direction?
I mean, there is evidence. We just look at the history of all of it. Yes, President Reagan worked out all of this with the Soviet Union, but then look at how that played out. Look at what the U.S. eventually did to the Soviet Union and then to the nascent Russian Federation after the collapse. The U.S. and the U.K. specifically went in there and they plundered the country. And if they could have, they would have kept Russia in that state had it not been for the rise of President Putin and the people around him. They would have subordinated Russia indefinitely to U.S. European interests. And that is their end game. That is what they want to do. And I think you said it, Glenn. Oops, we lost this conflict. We lost this conflict. We hit a brick wall. What do? We're not going to give up. And we know for a fact that they're not giving up because they're pivoting to China to pursue the exact same conflict, a conflict predicated entirely on the U.S. encroaching upon undermining Chinese sovereignty and attempting to eliminate the political circles in China, obstructing the reassertion of American primacy worldwide. I mean, when you just listen to the US, doesn't matter which president, they're always talking about American primacy in Asia. It's on the other side of the planet from where the US is located on a map. Why are they trying to assert primacy there? Why isn't it the largest, most powerful country in the region, which is China? Why don't they have primacy if any nation is to have primacy? And the interesting thing is China does not even seek primacy. They're working together with the other nations here. And I've lived here long enough to see the transition almost my entire adult life. I've lived here in Asia. And I moved here in the early 2000s when the US still mostly dominated the region before this rapid rise of China. And I saw the conditions here and I watched as China rose, the conditions rapidly improving with it because it's an entirely different model. It's not just China taking the place of the United States. Is an entirely different mindset and approach, and it is tangibly, obviously better. And that is why it's so troubling to see the U.S. so persistent on and trying to reassert this, to watch this region roll back. The same way the U.S. and Europe have kept Africa for generations, the Middle East for about 100 years now. It would be a tragedy to see that happen here. And people have to keep that in mind. Yes, the Trump administration is at least, if you want to take it for face value, you could pretend that they're seeking peace with Russia. At the same time, again, it's the exact same conflict they're pursuing with China. They have absolutely no reason, no justification. China poses no threat at all whatsoever to the continental United States or even American interests beyond unwarranted interests. The desire to exercise power and control over everyone on Earth is not a legitimate interest that you can complain about China undermining. So people have to keep that in mind. They have to zoom out, look at the whole picture. What is he really saying? He says he wants peace with Russia, but he's rushing off to war with China. The exact same kind of conflict that he's trying to apparently wrap up with Russia. But again, as just looking at the cycle of history, it is, at least to me, it's painfully obvious we're going in another cycle where the U.S. is buying time. They have no interest in accommodating Russia. This is when was the last time they have ever done this? Ever? Never. Including during the previous Trump administration. This has never happened, never even attempted, never even fleshed out in any real way. So why do we think now it's happening? Why aren't we suspicious that this is just because, as anyone can now see, even the Western media admits, Ukraine is losing. The U.S. is losing the proxy war. They're out of arms and ammunition. They couldn't do anything even if they wanted to. So obviously they're reacting to that, not some sudden interest in peace after 100, 200 years of war, expansionism, imperialism.
Yes, it's interesting. You said threat to national security, but it's also this issue now when you have hegemonic policy, when your security is defined as having global primacy, then of course any threat to hegemony is a threat to your security. And
Yes.
a few months ago, yeah, towards the end of the Biden administration, there was one of the spokespeople for the government was making this argument that any attempt to diversify away from the dollar is a threat to democracy. And the wheels started slowly go around. Like, how does this work? Oh yeah, you threatened the dollar, you threatened the hegemon. If you threaten the hegemon, you threaten our security. And if America is the only reason why the world has democracy, so our hegemon is linked to democracy. And if you go through this reasoning, I guess it could make sense. But if this is the goal for the United States to not scale back, but simply change its strategy, that is, they do recognize this is a conflict between the Chinese and Russians are a huge concern. It's the spearheading effectively the Eurasianism or Eurasian integration, which is undermining U.S. hegemony. So obviously, under the Biden administration, the main goal was, as they kept saying over and over again, let's knock out the Russians, and then we can focus our resource on the Chinese. It didn't work. I guess the reasonable or logical plan B at least would be to, okay, let's do what we did in Cold War. Let's reach out to the weaker of the two. This time it's the Russians, and we'll take them away from China, and this is the way we'll restore our dominance. And I find this to be interesting because this kind of shift in strategy, no one represents this better, I guess, than General Keith Kellogg, because 2 years ago he was, giving the speech. I think most people have seen it. We argued that, the destroying a strategic rival like Russia without using any American troops. He called this is the acme of professionalism. That is, we're destroying one adversary without using our troops, and then this will allow us to shift our focus and resources on confronting the Chinese. And yeah, I thought this was interesting. I even tweeted about it. I tweeted the video with the comment, and he actually wrote back on Twitter going, "Oh, thanks, Glenn. I got this from Sun Tzu." And again, I find this to be strange because I think he misunderstood what Sun Tzu meant in terms of, you know, winning a battle without fighting. In terms of pushing these two giants together, which was so unnecessary given that Russia's key objective after the Cold War is primarily integrate with the West. So, anyways, I thought it was funny his reply to me. But what's interesting is he shifted now because at the Munich peace conference, he he was saying, well, yeah, more or less, yeah, the war is over. Yeah, we have to make some concessions to Russia, but then he also stated that we have to unwind or disentangle some of these alliances which have appeared, because now the Russians are allied with themselves, with the Chinese, with the Iranians, with the North Koreans. This didn't happen. This didn't exist before the war. So now it's time to, yeah, try to win them over and break these ties. But it just, as you said, I lived I worked in Russia for a while as well, and they, with people who have like a foot or two inside the Kremlin, and they do see through this. Indeed, we did the same thing to the Chinese during the past 3 years. All these American leaders who were saying, let's destroy the Russians, and then we can focus on China. And then they go to China and say, hey, can you help us end the war? No, not actually negotiate or talk to the Russians, but let's just put pressure on them. In other words, help us to make the Russians capitulate. And at the same time, we're saying to our own audience, oh, once we defeated the Russians, then we'll take the Chinese. So you want to help the Chinese destroy themselves. I'm just wondering if they're cooking up a similar deal for the Russians. We'll embrace you. You'll be our best friend, but you're gonna have to turn on the Chinese. And once we've broken them, the foundation of our friendship is gone. Do you see this? Like, can this succeed though, or because I know many people in Russia, they're excited that finally the war can come to an end. The Americans are talking about Russian security concerns. They're recognizing that NATO expansion was something that threatened their security, which caused the war. So they're hearing everything they want. Do you think they can get swept away in this new enthusiasm of a new reset, as it was?
No, they definitely are. I don't, there's definitely people in Russia being swept away by this. There are even people in China being, buying into this, and because they want to believe that there isn't going to be this catastrophic confrontation with the US. They want to believe that this is all going to work out for them, but it's not going to. There's going to be a catastrophic confrontation. It's going to happen, and the longer you live in denial, the worse it will be for you when it finally comes. Look at US history, look at everything that they have done, look at what they're doing even right now. Out of one side of President Trump's mouth, he's talking about reconciling and recognizing the interests of Russia. Out of the other side of his mouth, he's talking about crushing BRICS. And why? Again, it's back to your point, Glenn. They are still pursuing global dominance. Again, go to the Senate hearings. Marco Rubio, his Senate hearing for confirmation as Secretary of State, Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense, Jamison Greer as U.S. Trade Representative. All they talked about for 2, 3, 4 hours was China, China, China. And it doesn't matter what topic they brought up. China is their obsession. And Russia is also part of it, but they understand that it's not working in Ukraine. They see it. It's just a fact that they have to reconcile with. Not that they want to. They don't want to. They don't want to admit that they've failed in Ukraine, just like there's a lot of Russians that don't want to admit that they failed in Syria. But they have. And if they want to continue pursuing global dominance, they need to recognize that, adapt and overcome it. And that's what they're doing. That is what the Trump administration is doing. That was actually what the Biden administration was doing. Again, see through the left-right rhetoric. They were both doing the exact same thing. The Biden administration for all 4 years, even though they seemed utterly obsessed on Russia, the entire time they were reorganizing the U.S. military to fight China in the Asia-Pacific region. They created the perfect stage. They set the perfect stage for the Trump administration to now pivot toward China. This is what is called continuity of agenda. And if you look through the rhetoric, you will see each administration step by step by step preparing for the next administration to continue all of this forward toward this continuous pursuit of global dominance. And they even literally use these words in the US Senate during their hearings. Each candidate, each nominee was talking about maintaining US dominance, political dominance, economic dominance, military dominance. And it's an irrational premise because the US represents only 5%, less than 5% of the global population. China alone has 4, 5 times the population of the US. It doesn't make sense to insist on not only dominating China, but dominating the entire planet. It doesn't make any sense, but this is from, generations of American, Western, I would say Western, European, and American supremacy. It's deeply rooted in their psyche, and this is what is driving them. And so at the end of the day, I don't hear them talking about dismantling NATO. Why does NATO exist? Can they explain why NATO exists? I hear U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance lecturing Europe about how dependent they are on the U.S. for security. Security against what? Before the U.S. overthrew the government of Ukraine in 2014, Europe was working very closely with both Russia and China to their benefit. And since the collapse of the Ukrainian government, thanks to U.S. intervention, Europe has done nothing but pay at their expense for this encroachment on Russia, this dismemberment of Ukraine's sovereignty, its rebuilding as a battering ram against Russia, and then this whole proxy war that has unfolded as a result. This has come at the expense of Europe, economically, politically, in terms of social stability. All of their prospects for the future gone because of this. So what security is the U.S. underwriting? It seems to me they obliterated European security. And so as long as people fall for this rhetoric, they're going to continue getting away with it. So it's only going to be when people finally say enough is enough. I'm not going to fall for the left-right rhetoric. I'm going to actually listen to what they're really saying because they are saying it openly, laying it all out for everyone to see. And I'm going to look at what they're actually doing, and I'm going to question what they're doing, not just because now it's my guy. I'm going to turn my brain off for the next 4 years and go along with everything. I'm going to think critically, no matter who is in office, and get to the bottom of what is really going on so that we can arrive at some sort of solution. I would say that no matter how, maybe it's a strong word, but delusional some people have become recently, they have the best intentions at heart. They don't want to see war. They don't want to see Russia and America fighting. I don't think they genuinely want war with China. They want this to resolve itself in peace and cooperation worldwide. But that's not what the special. You have to think like follow the money. Who is President Trump ultimately working for? What interests? Who's getting hundreds of billions of dollars already pledged by the Trump administration and the Biden administration and every administration before that? The arms industry, big pharma, big oil, all of these deeply entrenched corporate financier monopolies. These are the people driving U.S. foreign and domestic policy, no matter who is in office. So how is it that their interests are somehow now suddenly not being served by the Trump administration? All of a sudden, it doesn't add up.
Yeah, I guess that's the greatest challenge in assessing the Trump administration. As we talked about already, is cutting through the noise and see what's actually being done. Because you see the same in the Middle East; they would like to end the forever war, but also annex Gaza and ethnically cleanse the entire population. They want to rebuild Ukraine, but also take half of its natural resources. And of course, there's a campaign against the deep state, but at the same time, the entire front row of Trump's inauguration appear to be the tech oligarchs. Yes. So there are some mixed signals, and I guess, as he said, yeah, we see what we want to see. I just had a final question though, because you've been following, the war very detailed on the ground in Ukraine, and irrespective of American intentions, the mere fact that the United States decided to talk to Russia is having some impact, it seems. At least in Europe, everyone's up in arms. America betrayed us. It's a new world. So some of the ties are being damaged. In Ukraine, we see some of the collapse in morale, not just by the soldiers on the ground, but also by military leaders. Again, why they're still fighting now, when the war is being discussed, how to end it, far away by the Americans and the Russians. So, you're not at a mutiny yet, but again, the whole idea that Ukraine should have a role well, it doesn't really, I guess, because if Zelensky doesn't fall in line, he's so unpopular now, and he doesn't have any alternatives. It would be easy to have him replaced, if not through elections, then simply by mutiny. But how do you see the mere fact that the Americans and the Russians are now talking? How is this impacting the war, irrespective of where the negotiations might lead?
Well, think of the paradox here. President Trump is blaming the war on Ukraine, saying they should have cut a deal or something with Russia. They had no opportunity to do that because from 2014 onward, they were just an extension of U.S. foreign policy. And so isn't that the ultimate paradox, that it's the U.S. talking directly to Russia with nobody else at the table? Doesn't that prove once and for all that this is a U.S. proxy war? Ukraine is a proxy, but even Europe, to a very large extent, is a proxy of U.S. foreign policy, especially in regards to this conflict. And at the same time, President Trump is trying to frame this in a way that it's somehow it's not America's fault. They're just the ones resolving it. I heard Secretary Rubio saying something about President Trump is the only leader in the world that can end this conflict. He played an equal hand in starting it, in lighting this fire, the arsonist putting the fire out, if you will. As far as what's going to happen inside Ukraine, the U.S. has created a monster. They radicalized large segments of the Ukrainian population. They honestly, deeply, emotionally believe in this fight. This is why they have fought so long and so hard, and why they've stuck in there. How do you unravel that? How do you undo that? I don't really think there's an easy way to do that. The U.S. Has faced similar problems with extremists they've used elsewhere around the world, in Syria, for example, in Iraq, against Lebanon. And so this is it's a cycle that just continuously repeats itself. As far as President Zelensky goes, again, he is a proxy. He's along for the ride. He's going to complain. He's going to kick and scream, but ultimately it's up to the U.S. And if he doesn't go along with the program, they will replace him. And nothing that he himself can do is going to change anything that is about to happen. It always was the US in the driver's seat from 2014 onward. That's very important for people to keep in mind as all of this takes place. Even this kicking and screaming by Europe. I mean, how seriously can we take this? Europe has been politically captured by the US for a very long time. Do people remember when it was Olaf Scholz on the stage with President Biden, and President Biden's basically saying, we're going to get rid of the Nord Stream 2 pipe, like right next to him. And he just stood there, like a little kid with his dad, and his dad's explaining that it's bedtime. There is no sovereignty. There is no agency. There really is nothing that they can do because they have surrendered so much of their economy, their military, even their political structure to the US and the special interests that drive US foreign policy, including in regards to Europe. So again, it is whatever the US decides it's going to be. I think a lot of the Europeans complaining, this has to be theater to make it convincing, that, well, we don't want this. This is being imposed upon us. And this isn't something we haven't seen in the past. This is, again, this left, you could call it left-right, American-European strategy of tension, where they pretend everybody is at odds when in reality they've been working in lockstep all along.
I think the final subordination by Germany was in October of 2024 when Biden was given the highest honor in Germany, that is the president of Germany. Steinmeier, he was giving a medal of the highest order of merit to President Biden as a friend of Germany. Even now, it's become very obvious, I guess, who blew up their pipelines, who destroyed their energy infrastructure. And when Germany was in its hour of need in terms of being deindustrialized, the US came over and offered economic incentives for its companies to just move across to the US. So, and this is when they decided to give him a medal. So, no, I think, well, I think that the Europeans can take the abuse if America changes its mind in the future. Europe will come running back. So I don't think it's one should waste that much, I guess, energy on the consequence of this split. Anyways, Brian Berletic, thank you so much for your time. It's been very, very interesting, and I think some different perspectives on this reset are very, very important. So thanks again.
Thank you.